The F-106 is designed to be a fully capable, highly effective, all-weather interceptor for use by the United States Air Force Air Defense Command units. Deliveries to these units will start in 1959. The tactical versions of the Convair F-106A single place and the F-106B dual place are supersonic Mach 2 aircraft powered by the Pratt & Whitney J-75 P-17 engine. Both carry their armament internally, with basic armament for each consisting of 4 Falcon missiles and 1 MB-1 nuclear rocket. Test activities for the year 1958 involved detailed testing of all elements of the weapons system, from laboratory testing of components to an extensive flight program. The F-106A and B Accelerated Development Program involved 42 aircraft, of which 17 were assigned to the contractor portion of the test program. This film report will present the significant highlights of the 1958 program. For the purpose of this report, the program will be divided into 3 sections. The first, or flight test section, will concern those activities covered in the actual flight program. The second, or support testing phase, will involve those component activities investigated through laboratory-controlled examinations. And the final armament section will report on the development program designed to demonstrate F-106 armament delivery capability. At the Air Force Flight Test Center, in-flight examinations included evaluations of the F-106 external wing tanks, F-106A spin testing, J-75 engine evaluations, and the initial flight and preliminary flight test evaluations of the F-106B aircraft. Early in the year, aircraft 56-451 was assigned to the spin program. This program was conducted to determine the stall and spin characteristics for F-106A aircraft. Aircraft 451 received all special spin equipment installations at Convair San Diego Experimental Facility before being returned to Edwards Flight Test Center for the flight program. Recovery strakes installed on each side of the aircraft could be extended during a spin to assist in spin recovery. A spin recovery chute was installed in a special container mounted at the base of the vertical fin. Used as a secondary safety precaution against spin conditions, this device was activated by ballistically firing a pilot chute into the airstream, pulling the recovery chute behind it. Special pilot safety equipment included a single-action ejection seat and a modified G-suit to protect the pilot against longitudinal G-loads in the event of high spin rates. All equipment was thoroughly tested in flight examinations to ensure proper performance before beginning the spin investigations. A total of 31 spins were made, beginning with preliminary spins in April of 1958. Initially, recovery was made before a fully developed spin was reached. Later spins were allowed to progress until the full spin was accomplished. During these developed spins, a condition was encountered where the airplane would gyrate after stalling. This condition came to be known as a post-stall gyration. Detailed examinations of this condition determined its cause, the warnings preceding it, and the proper recovery technique necessary. Analysis of the data obtained in the spin program demonstrated F-106A compliance with the applicable Air Force specifications. Following completion of the spin program, aircraft 56-451 was stripped of all special spin equipment, provisions were added to carry external fuel, and a program was conducted to clear all F-106A and B aircraft to carry and use the external drop tanks. At the completion of tank installations on the aircraft, ground shake tests were made, clearing the aircraft for flight flutter testing at the Air Force Flight Test Center. These tests were satisfactorily completed with full tank loads at altitudes of 5,000 and 15,000 feet. Speeds were at Mach 0.75, 0.85, and 0.95. During jettison testing, 9 tanks were expended, 7 single-tank jettisons, and 1 dual jettison. Altitudes were at 15,000 and 35,000 feet. The drops were accomplished at 2 different speeds, Mach 0.4 and 0.95. At the conclusion of the program, external fuel usage testing was completed on aircraft 452 up to a speed of Mach 0.95, with altitudes ranging to 40,000 feet in climb, dive, and level flight conditions. As a result of this program, sufficient data was obtained to clear all F-106A and B aircraft to carry and use external drop tanks. During the 1958 test program, several changes were made in the F-106 propulsion system to improve propulsion and aircraft performance. Thinning of the external inlet duct cowlings resulted in a satisfactory drag improvement. The slotted ramp replaced the earlier perforated ramp. This change increased pressure recovery due to improved bleeding of boundary air and resulted in a 3% increase in thrust. A flight program to determine optimum ramp scheduling for the new slotted ramp established ramp operational standards for all production aircraft. 5 tail cone configurations were evaluated in a program consisting of 22 flight missions. The original cone, shortened by 4.6 inches, resulted in an effective combination of drag thrust improvement. Improvements in ejector design led to the acceptance of the convergent divergent ejector, with the resulting thrust increase of 8% at design speed over the basic engine configuration. The Pratt & Whitney J75 P-17 engine was accepted for all F-106 aircraft over the earlier P-1 and P-9 versions. This engine included all basic improvements made in the earlier models. Rotating of the first stage inlet guide vanes and thinning of the second stage inlet guide vanes increased the flow area and resulted in relieving of low-energy stalls. First stage turbine inlet guide vanes were changed to a new alloy with heat characteristics that allowed higher operating temperatures than alloys used in earlier models of the J75 engines. The results of the propulsion program have confirmed the compatibility of the F-106 airframe and the J75 P-17 engine. These improvements have raised installed engine thrust and temperature limits to design specification requirements. F-106 aircraft, in which all of the new modifications have been incorporated, have now flown at the design speed of Mach 2. The first F-106B aircraft, 57-2507, moved off the production line at Convair, San Diego during the early part of 1958. The aircraft was then delivered by truck to the Air Force Flight Test Center, and after thorough ground checkout evaluations, made a successful first flight on April 10th. The F-106B is designed to be a fully capable two-place interceptor aircraft with a complete F-106 armament system. It will serve as a tactical aircraft and, in addition, be used to familiarize pilots with the F-106A weapons system. Similar in appearance to the F-106A, the F-106B has a longer and slightly raised canopy. Dimensions are equal to that of the A. Wingspan, 38 feet, 1 inch. Overall length, 70 feet, 8 inches. Height to the tip of the vertical stabilizer, 20 feet, 3 inches. The approximate takeoff gross weight with full internal fuel load is 34,751 pounds. As a result of the similarity between the A and the B, the 1958 B flight test program was primarily devoted to examination of the significant differences between the two aircraft. Preliminary results have demonstrated that the F-106B maintains the same excellent handling characteristics of the F-106A. Climb and acceleration performance is essentially the same, with general performance in other areas comparable to the F-106A. Thorough testing of the complex electronic cooling and air conditions systems of an F-106 aircraft would be impractical using normal flight test methods. Necessary instrumentation and time would be very costly to the development program. For these reasons, an electronic cooling test stand laboratory was built at the contractor's San Diego testing area. The test stand chamber will hold an entire F-106 fuselage and is capable of recreating both transient and steady state temperature and altitude conditions for the entire flight range of an F-106 aircraft. Temperature can be varied from minus 60 degrees to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. The test stand method produces the data and development information necessary in proving the F-106 electronic cooling system adequate to the great demands made on it in actual flight operation. Changes in the F-106 cooling system, when proved necessary by test stand investigation, are incorporated into production aircraft following retest approval. A brief flight program confirms test stand results. The data available from this testing would be impossible to obtain without the test stand facility. The resulting savings in cost and time have proved invaluable in the F-106 development program. The skin of the 9 fuel tanks dispersed throughout the wings and fuselage of the F-106 are designed to withstand thermal stress as well as stress due to internal tank pressure and flight loads. The contractor established the Point Loma Structures test site in conjunction with the Air Force to test the effectiveness of the machine-sculptured, Scotch-weld-bonded tank skins. The jig work, electrical, fuel, and hydraulic systems here are adequate to subject fuel tank test specimens to a full range of simulated flight conditions. The tests conducted were on 3 tanks: the forward wing tank, the wing transfer tank, and the fuselage tank. Each tank was placed in its own special jig to most accurately apply flight loading conditions. All internal and external flight load conditions encountered in the full range of operation of an F-106 were mechanically produced through whiffletree and hydraulic actuator arrangements. Both static and extensive cycling loads tests were conducted through varying temperature conditions ranging from sub-zero through ambient to hot. Reduction of the data recorded from thermocouples, strain gauges, and other instrumentation determined that the machine-sculptured integral Scotch-weld wing tanks met design requirements. For the purpose of developing a high-efficiency F-106 radome, a special research and design group was formed within the electronic section of Convair San Diego as early as September 1955. Primary mission of the group was the development of a high-efficiency radome for the F-106. The basic concern was to design a radome which would allow efficient passage of the radiated energy search beam, and to ensure that the radar waves would complete passage through the radome with as little distortion as possible. The ideal radome would be electrically transparent, causing no radiation distortion. Since this is impossible, the distortions of the best possible radome must be measured and compensated for. To back up the design predictions based on this theory, the radome laboratory tested many radome experimental shapes with their complete test facilities. Bore sight range, direct physical measurement, high temperature dielectrometer, free space interferometer, and other complex equipment were employed. From this background of research and testing, the Convair Radome Design Group has developed a radome shape and manufacturing technique which meets the demanding performance requirements of the F-106 fire control system. The technique has resulted in two major conclusions. One, it has reduced the insertion phase difference, or IPD variation, from 10 electrical degrees to 1. And two, it makes practical a method of reproduction with high physical standard from part to part. In addition, engineers can now predict electrical performance in terms of known radar properties and can maintain electrical variations within extremely narrow error tolerances. Matched to the gimbal of the MA-1, the radar antenna is individually bore-sighted to ensure accurate installation, and final checks are made before the delivery of the aircraft to the Air Force. With these newly developed design, development testing, and manufacturing methods, a very high degree of accuracy has been obtained in this vital component of the fire control system. With today's interceptor aircraft pressing farther and farther into the range of supersonic speeds, the need and urgency for developing a pilot ejection system that will function at subsonic, transonic, and supersonic speeds at minimum and maximum altitudes is vital. In view of this, the Industry Crew Escape Systems Committee was formed to coordinate a developmental approach to safe ejection from supersonic aircraft. First considerations included both an upward ejection system and a downward ejection system. The Air Force assigned Convair the responsibility of developing the needed upward ejection system for Century Series aircraft. In Convair's program, two types of seats were originally considered: the A, or skip flow generator type, and the B, or bobsled type. After initial evaluations, Convair, with the approval of the ICESC committee, concentrated its development efforts on the second, or B, seat design. The pilot is ejected on his back at a 90-degree launch attitude, a launch position especially desirable because G-loads tolerances for humans are greatest at this angle. Preliminary wind tunnel and slingshot testing of a 1/10th scale model led to a full-scale wind blast program at the Air Force Flight Test Center. These runs were used to indicate the wind blast forces on the seat and pilot. In all, there were 5 runs conducted at speeds of 627 to 858 knots. Both low and high altitude flight gear was examined for wind blast results. In all post-run examinations of this test series, the pilot and his personal equipment was found to be in near pre-run condition. The first full-scale aerodynamic testing of the B seat was accomplished on the ARDC Supersonic Missile and Rocket Track at Hurricane Mesa, Utah. 3 objectives were accomplished in this test series. 1, the full-scale seat-simulated ejection performance as planned. 2, the validity of the slingshot tests were verified by the flight attitude of the seat. And 3, the test confirmed the results of the previous wind blast tests on the pilot and personal equipment. It was established that the seat configuration had good yaw and pitch stability, but did have excessive roll. At this point, telescopic booms were added to control the roll. Following slingshot evaluations, further testing at Hurricane Mesa using the new booms resulted in near-perfect seat flight, with no pitch, no yaw, and with only a negligible roll. During 1958, testing of the complete B-seat ejection system was conducted on the sled run track at the Air Force Flight Test Center. Speed for this series ranged from 132 to 750 knots. Results of the program to date have demonstrated that the B-seat, as developed, will provide a reliable upward escape system for today's supersonic aircraft pilots. To date, this is the only type seat that has been successfully ejected from a sled-simulated aircraft cockpit at supersonic airspeed and remained aerodynamically stable and maintained accelerations within human tolerance. The sled tests showed that the configurations were stable over a speed range extending from 132 to 750 knots. It is felt that the operating principles of the B-seat may be extended to much higher speed while maintaining good low-level, low-speed performance. In 1959, the B-seat will go into hardware production for installation in tactical F-106 Interceptor aircraft. Initial F-106 armament phases and test programs are conducted at the Missile Development Center at Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico. The activities here have fallen into 2 general categories: those involving Convair armament subsystems testing and those involving a joint contractor Air Force effort to harmonize the overall system. The Convair aircraft, numbers 458 and 460, were engaged in MB-1 ejection and ballistic studies and Falcon missile launching evaluations. The MB-1 ejection and ballistics program comprised a series of tests to demonstrate the compatibility of the unguided nuclear warhead rocket and the ejection system of the F-106. Prior to any live firings from an aircraft, inert rockets were ejected under various flight conditions. These tests determined rocket separation characteristics, but indicated that at a high Q condition, the rockets had high nose-up characteristics. This was corrected by a baffle and a 2-inch shorter stroke for the aft gun. Live motored rocket tests were made next to obtain clearance of the F-106A flight envelope. To date, MB-1s have been ejected on this program at speeds from Mach 0.9 to Mach 2 and over an altitude range of 10,000 to over 50,000 feet. The MB-1 ejection launcher proved efficient and highly reliable through repeated firings. The AD program, or Armament and Aircraft Weapons Control System Development Program, is a joint effort among the Air Force, Convair, Hughes, and Douglas. Among the primary objectives of this program was the flight operation of the highly advanced fire control system, the MA-1, designed and built by Hughes Aircraft. This MA-1 system is composed of many subsystems, each in itself a complex system. Search and tracking radar, digital computer, communications system, navigational aid components, landing system aids, automatic flight control systems to be activated when cleared, and the armament auxiliary equipment. The MB-1 manual firing phase was started in December of 1958. 3 successful firings were made at an altitude of 20,000 feet and at a speed of Mach 1.25 against manned targets. The AD program provided the necessary changes required to give proven capability to tactical type F-106s in manual mode MB-1 firings. The accomplishments of the F-106 all-weather Supersonic Interceptor in its armament and in all flight testing to date has lived up to every design prediction.
Convair Division of General Dynamics received authorization on 12 February 1969 to proceed with the design, fabrication, installation, and testing of the General Electric M61A1 20mm Vulcan gun system and of a clear-top canopy. F-106A, serial number 580795, arrived at the San Diego facility on 17 February, and the design and aircraft modifications were initiated in our experimental building. The gun and accessories are palletized and enclosed in a structural box suspended from the aft center missile bay roof. This location was selected to eliminate engine inlet ingestion problems associated with other aircraft gun installations. The structural enclosure has an opening in the forward bulkhead for the ram air inlet, with the ram air scoop located in the environmental compartment door. This ram air system operates whenever gun firing is initiated and performs continuously for 30 seconds after firing shutdown. A double-ended, closed-loop, linkless ammunition feed system is used. Empty cases and cleared rounds are returned to the ammunition drum rather than being ejected during firing. The drum holds 650 rounds of 20mm ball, armor-piercing incendiary, or high-explosive incendiary ammunition. The entrance chute feeds ammunition to the breech, with the exit chute returning empty cases to the drum. Installation of the gun system in a structural box provides a means of isolating gun components from the missile bay and facilitates environmental conditioning during firing. Installing the gun necessitates removal of the Air-2A capability, but does not affect the AIM-4 system. During Convair's testing, the forward AIM-4 missiles and launchers were removed to make space for the instrumentation. Aft missile bay inner doors were modified to close on the sides of the gun compartment. Missile bay doors forward of the gun muzzle were also modified to prevent damage from gun blast. Other modifications included a 27-gallon per minute Vickers hydraulic pump in the secondary system to provide sufficient hydraulic flow to set the gunfire rate at 4,300 shots per minute. An optical reflex gun sight, consisting of components from several different gun sight models, was provided from Air Force inventory and was mounted to the forward windshield frame support. The design, fabrication, and installation of the gun system and canopy were completed on 23 July 1969. And the aircraft was ferried to Edwards Air Force Base for ground and flight testing on 6 August 1969. From 8 through 12 August, the aircraft's instrumentation subsystem and ground support instrumentation systems for recording temperatures, pressures, and load stress parameters were set up at the Edwards Air Force Base 1,000-foot gun butts, and initial testing started. Initial ammunition loadings and proofing of gun firing procedures were conducted, and the first ground firing of 100-round bursts was accomplished on 13 August. An 8mm bore sight target was placed 1,000 inches forward of the gun muzzle. This target is utilized to align the gun with aircraft geometry for proper bore sighting and includes corrections for throw and dwell, which are associated with gun firing dynamics. The gun was fired through the 1,000-inch bore sight target into the 14 by 14-foot target at a range of 1,000 feet. Of the rounds fired, 95 to 99% were within an 8-foot diameter bullseye on this target. Ground test firings progressed from 100 through 200, 400, 500, and 650 round bursts. Due to the shooting system and the final rounds clearing cycle, the gun fires 625 shots out of 650 rounds loaded. On 25 August, the final ground firing of 625 rounds was conducted with the aircraft's engine running and with the gun controlled from the cockpit. Prior to receipt of the gun at Convair, 17,784 rounds were fired through this system for reliability and proofing tests at the General Electric Armament Facility at Burlington, Vermont. During Convair's ground test program, 4,113 rounds of ball ammunition were fired. A combined total of 21,897 rounds were fired through the system before proceeding with the flight test phase. Ammunition was loaded at the Edwards Air Force Base hot gun line in preparation for the first flight on 27 August. A complete complement of 650 rounds of ball ammunition was linked together as a continuous belt on the ammunition cart. Gun loading was accomplished with a pneumatic loader. The gun could also be loaded hydraulically with power supplied by the engine running at idle. As ammunition is received into the gun system, the loading links are ejected overboard and retained for future use. Upon completion of the loading sequence, the fairing door was secured and the aircraft was ready for its first gun-firing flight. The symbols on the F-106A flight envelope indicate the actual altitude and airspeed gun-firing parameters successfully conducted by Convair. Altitude, 3,000 to 35,000 feet. Mach number, 0.6 to 1.9. Calibrated airspeed, 165 to 690 knots. The F-106 gun system performed successfully at the aircraft's design load factors of -3G to +7G, and during maximum side slips, hinge moment limit turns, and in simulated aerial combat maneuvers. The superior flight performance of the F-106 above 35,000 feet was not demonstrated during this feasibility program, as the parameters of Mach and temperatures above this test altitude are redundant. Following are selected sequences from the 9 test flights conducted for data acquisition. After 25 minutes of cold soak, the first firing of 610 rounds in a continuous burst was conducted over the Pacific Missile Range at 35,000 feet, 0.6 Mach. Altitude 25,000 feet, 1.1 Mach, while firing 90 rounds. The camera speed is 250 frames per second, therefore the gun action is slowed considerably. Gun gas trails aft and away from the engine inlets and is not a problem with this installation. Here, the aircraft is in a -1G pushover at 35,000 feet altitude, 0.92 Mach, while firing an 87-round burst. Altitude 25,000 feet, 1.1 Mach, while firing a 193 round burst. A 90-round firing at a calibrated airspeed of 165 knots at 10,000 feet. The clear-top canopy consists of a one-piece, 3/4-inch thick cast acrylic enclosure formed to extend over the top with the sides bulged to the pilot's head. This acrylic enclosure fits into modified existing canopy structure and is interchangeable with the production canopy assembly. In order to meet the stringent schedule and cost commitments of this program, the canopy was cleared for unpressurized flight only and was restricted to 25,000 feet altitude at a speed of 660 knots calibrated. Firing 197 rounds with a clear-top canopy installed was accomplished at 25,000 feet, 1.5 Mach, 660 knots calibrated. A total of 5,237 rounds were fired during Convair's flight test program. A cumulative total of 27,134 rounds were expended during all phases of testing. 2 AIM-4 missiles were carried in the aft bay during a series of flights. Firing of the M61A1 gun does result in an increase in the vibration level imposed on the launch rail of the AIM-4 missiles. This increased vibration level is, however, significantly below the level imposed by the turbulent airstream when the missiles are extended to their normal launch position. A total of 7.5 months were required from go-ahead to the delivery of the aircraft to Tyndall Air Force Base on 25 September, 4 days ahead of schedule. Successful completion of the M61A1 gun and clear-top canopy test program is signified by the Victory Roll.
A parched and forbidding wasteland to those who've journeyed through it over the years, the Western Mojave is a harsh, inhospitable land of sometimes stunning contrasts. A land of bone-chilling nights and griddle-hot days, of violent dust storms and mesmerizing sunsets. The primitive landscape is dominated by one truly remarkable feature. When she first gazed upon it early in this century, homesteader Jeanette Darr said of it, "I thought it was the jumping-off place of creation, that curiously flat wasteland called Dry Lake." Many years later, however, aviation pioneer General Albert Boyd would call it God's gift to the Air Force. First formed in the Pleistocene epoch, Rogers Dry Lake is one of nature's most unique creations. The flattest and hardest of all natural landforms, its parched clay and silt surface undergoes a timeless cycle of renewal each year, as water from winter storms is swept back and forth by desert winds, smoothing it out to an almost glass-like flatness. Spreading out over 65 square miles, it is the largest geological formation of its kind in the world. The open spaces of the high desert, its isolation, arid climate, the clear blue skies overhead, and, most importantly, the vast expanse of lake bed, were what caught the attention of then Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold when in 1933 he was looking about for a bombing and gunnery range for his Marchfield squadrons. Where others had seen a curiously flat wasteland, Hap Arnold saw a natural airfield. In September of that year, a small contingent of troops arrived at the spot then called Muroc and laid out a bombing and gunnery range along the east shore of the lake bed. For the troops who comprised the Muroc Range Maintenance Detachment throughout the 30s, the place had little to offer. Theirs would be a tough, hardscrabble existence, life in a primitive tent camp community, long days of backbreaking work, with few of the conveniences of civilization, and even fewer diversions to relieve the tedium of their daily routines. Their isolation seemed so complete, in fact, that among locals it came to be known as the Foreign Legion of the Army Air Corps. Their lonely exile was periodically interrupted, however, as flying units came in for training exercises. Among the first to arrive was a young captain named Ira Aker, commander of the 95th Pursuit Squadron, and, a decade later, the entire 8th Air Force. He was followed by countless others, as the remote bombing and gunnery range more than lived up to Hap Arnold's expectations. Indeed, by 1941, Muroc had become a regular stop for the men who would guide American air power through the perilous times ahead. By that time, though most of the range maintenance detachments still lived in tents, a new, more permanent facility was rising up across the lake bed. And while training exercises proceeded, there were other activities taking place almost unnoticed, which were harbingers of things to come. John Northup had been flight testing his M1M Jeep, his first true flying wing, at Muroc since 1940. By the late fall of 1941, a primitive sled track had been built on the lake bed, where small, remotely controlled aircraft were being ground tested. Not far away, an exotic-looking, semi-tailless airplane was undergoing taxi tests. The airplane was the Curtiss Wright CW-24B, a full-scale wood and fabric flying mock-up for a proposed Interceptor. Now all but forgotten, the CW-24B lifted off from the parched surface of the lake bed for the first time on December 2, 1941, thereby becoming the first of more than 100 airplanes that would complete their maiden flights at this out-of-the-way place on the high deserts. 5 days later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and Muroc suddenly erupted with activity as troops and flying units from all over the country hastily assembled there. Barracks, hangars, mess halls, and other facilities, marvels of tar paper wire and wood, as one of the troops called them, went up almost overnight on what became known as South Base. And in July of 1942, Muroc Army Air Base finally became a separate post. Its primary mission was to provide final combat training for fighter and bomber crews, and throughout the war years, thousands of young men would pass through it just prior to overseas deployment. It was at Muroc in 1942, for example, that Lieutenant Colonel Curtis LeMay first assembled and trained his famed 305th Bomb Group, molding it into a legendary fighting unit which set new standards for effectiveness in the mighty 8th Air Force. And it was to Muroc late in the war that by then Major General LeMay would send the cream of his 21st Air Force for B-29 bait crew training as they prepared for the final assault on Japan. It was at Muroc these crews perfected their ability to navigate over vast distances and employ their bombing equipment with the kind of pinpoint accuracy which would have such a decisive impact on the outcome of the Pacific War. A much different type of mission had gotten underway at a restricted area just 6 miles to the north. There, at a top-secret test site, the crated pieces of a radically new type of aircraft were unloaded from boxcars on September 19, 1942, and over the next 10 days it was hastily assembled. The airplane was the Bell XP-59A Era Comet, and on October 2nd, Bell test pilot Bob Stanley launched America into the jet age as he lifted off from the lake bed. Testing continued over the next 2 years, and though the P-59 disappointingly lacked the performance of the best prop-driven fighters of the day, it nevertheless represented a start, the first of a long series of airplanes that would make the high desert base synonymous with the turbojet revolution in America. Indeed, the availability of the enormous lake bed made it almost inevitable. The development of the turbojet engine introduced a host of new problems. The new power plants were woefully underpowered, and thus the new jets required exceptionally long takeoff rolls. More critically still, the temperamental engines flamed out, and if pilots couldn't recover from engine stalls, their only hope was close proximity to a spacious airfield where they could attempt dead-stick landings. With miles and miles of available runways extending in every direction, the lake bed offered the most spacious landing field in the world. Throughout the decades ahead, it would be a welcome haven for countless pilots in distress. Thus, while the major training mission continued throughout the war, a growing number of aircraft, conventional airplanes such as the P-38 Lightning and the Lockheed Constellation, unconventional prototypes such as Northrop's XP-56 Black Bullet, purely experimental aircraft such as the N-9M, and the rocket-powered MX-324, and even captured enemy aircraft such as the Me-163 Comet and the HE-162 Volksjäger, were also undergoing flight test evaluations at the rapidly expanding North Base facility. In January of 1944, a major milestone occurred when a new Lockheed jet-powered prototype, the XP-80, lifted off for its maiden flight. Demonstrating the truly remarkable advances that had been made in little more than a year since the XP-59's first flight, this impressive airplane was the prototype for America's first combat-worthy jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. Where the P-59 had been outperformed by prop-driven fighters, the P-80 demonstrated in test set Muroff that it could successfully attack bomber formations even when outnumbered 6-1 by the very best of the conventional fighters, and it convinced everyone that the Air Force would have to undergo a rapid transition into jet propulsion. The remarkable potential of that transition was underscored in June of 1947, when Colonel Albert Boyd returned the world speed record to America for the first time in 24 years, as he sped to more than 623 miles per hour over a course above the lake bed in a modified P-80R. It was the first of some 14 world speed records that would be set at the base over the next 18 years. But Boyd and other Air Force officials had set their sights much higher than speed records. As he stood proudly on the ramp that day, he'd already made a decision which would dramatically alter the future course of aviation and indeed aerospace history. For he'd chosen the pilot and test crew who'd challenged the so-called and much dreaded sound barrier. The X-1 program was the first in a long series of X or experimental programs that were designed to prove or disprove concepts, to probe the most challenging unknowns of flight and solve their mysteries. It was conceived in response to a new and terrifying phenomenon which fighter pilots had first encountered during the recent war. Pushing over into steep dives, they'd found themselves at speeds of 500 miles per hour and into the unknown region of transonic flight, where the effects of compressibility, loss of control, and structurally devastating aerodynamic loads began to take over with often deadly consequences. The new jet engines promised even higher speeds passing through the transonic and even perhaps into the supersonic region. The critical question was, could a piloted airplane be designed and built which could survive in it? The aircraft designed to make the assault was the bullet-shaped, rocket-powered Bell X-1, and the man who would try to fly it through the sonic wall was a young Air Force captain named Chuck Yeager. Assisted by a team from Bell and the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, he and project engineer Captain Jackie Ridley had a lot on their minds as Yeager edged his way cautiously toward Mach 1 throughout the fall of 1947. Military test pilots at that time didn't get many opportunities to fly such hazardous experimental programs. Thus he felt he had a lot to prove as the B-29 lifted off for his 9th powered flight on the morning of October 14th. He'd already flown out to Mach 0.997, just a hair's breadth away from the sonic wall, and yet what lay ahead was still a mystery, and there were still many who thought that what he was attempting was tantamount to suicide. At 20,000 feet, the X-1 was released. Igniting the chambers of his rocket engine, Yeager began to climb. Then, at 43,000 feet, the X-1 shot through the sound barrier and remained supersonic for about 20 seconds. The sharp double crack of his sonic boom that morning signaled the dawn of a remarkable era during which a high desert outpost called Muroc would become identified with the most daring concepts in aviation. And it triggered a series of events which would ultimately vault man beyond the atmosphere and into space. But first, the remarkable potential of the turbojet engine had to be realized, and there were perplexing challenges to be overcome before that could happen. Not only were the early engines underpowered, they also consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and this severely limited range capability. Turboprops offered an attractive alternative, but the XP-81's performance simply couldn't match that promised by pure jet configurations. The XF-85 embodied the so-called parasite concept. Designed to be carried in the bomb bay of a heavy bomber, it would be carried deep into enemy territory, released, chase off enemy interceptors, and then return and hook up with the mother ship. On the first hookup attempt, however, the test pilot was nearly decapitated. And though a successful hookup was ultimately accomplished, the idea wasn't really practical. Another solution was to build big fighters, which could carry vast quantities of fuel. But this was a self-defeating solution, producing increased weight and drag, which imposed unacceptable performance penalties. Thus, most of the long procession of fighter prototypes that were put through their paces at Muroc during the post-war years represented little more than transitional designs, as engine designers tried to build more powerful and fuel-efficient engines, and aircraft designers struggled to develop airframes that could optimize their potential. Most of the new prototypes were overweight, underpowered, and during a time of dramatic technological breakthroughs, already obsolete compared to new designs then coming off the drawing boards. The North American XF-86 was by far the most successful of these transitional designs. The first American jet to employ swept wings to delay the onset of compressibility and enhance high-speed maneuverability, it was already diving to supersonic speeds just 6 months after it first flew in October of 1947. And it went on to enjoy a better than 10-to-1 kill ratio against enemy fighters in hostile skies over Korea. Post-war bomber development ran into many of the same problems encountered by the fighter programs. Most of the new prototype bombers on the ramp at Muroc represented early attempts to blend the new turbojet technology with conventional aerodynamic designs. In fact, America's first jet bomber, the Douglas XB-43, resulted from a simple, straightforward modification of the piston-engined XB-42. Graceful and streamlined, the XB-46 was already considered obsolete when it arrived at Muroc at the end of its first flight in April of 1947. And the robust B-45, though it went into operational service, was, from the very outset, never intended to serve as anything more than an interim bomber. As with the fighters, first true advance came with the introduction of swept wings on Boeing's B-47. Capable of speeds in excess of 600 miles per hour, this airplane was developed into the thoroughbred of the Air Force's post-war bomber fleet. The most radical design by far, however, was Northrop's Mammoth Flying Wing. Originally designed with a complicated system of pusher props and designated the XB-35, it was ultimately reconfigured with jets and transformed into the majestic YB-49. The culmination of Northrop's attempts to build a pure flying wing, it represented a bold leap into the future, which those who saw it knifing its way through the skies over Muroc would never forget. One of its test pilots was a young Californian named Captain Glenn Edwards. Along with Major Dan Forbes, he was flying one of the prototypes in June of 1948 when it broke apart in the sky northwest of the base. All 5 crew members were lost. In December of 1949, Muroc Air Force Base was renamed in honor of the young test pilot. As the base entered the 50s, the tempo increased dramatically. A wide variety of new types and models of aircraft appeared on the flight line every year, as Edwards became known as the place where the rubber meets the ramp. It had long since become the de facto center of American flight research, and in June of 1951, that status was finally recognized officially as the base was designated the U.S. Air Force Flight Test Center, and a $120 million master plan was implemented to build an entirely new main base complex north of the existing facility. But the mission went far beyond flight testing. At the north end of the lake bed, tests were being run on a 2,000-foot deceleration track, where Colonel John Stapp and his team of aeromedical researchers were studying the human body's tolerance for G-forces and developing safety equipment that would save countless lives. Using himself as a test subject, Stapp ultimately proved that when properly restrained, the human body is amazingly resilient, as he went on to survive a 45G deceleration. The world's fastest railroad was in operation at the south end of the lake bed, likened to an outdoor wind tunnel because everything, airfoils and aerodynamic shapes to ejection systems and other aircraft components, could be tested in real-world conditions. The 10,000-foot high-speed sled track permitted speeds of more than 1,500 miles per hour. While the rocket sled blistered across the flatlands below, another, much different enterprise was getting underway, high on a granite ridge overlooking the lake bed. At the Air Force's captive missile test site, the ground quaked to the massive roar of the rocket engines that would begin to launch America into the space age. Back in the 30s and 40s, men had come to Muroc to train for combat. In the early 50s, they started coming to train as test pilots. By the time the Air Force's Experimental Test Pilot School moved from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to Edwards in 1951, the role of the test pilot had undergone a radical change from the pre-jet era. The job had always required exceptional precision flying skills, keen powers of observation, coolness under pressure, and the ability to fly a mission exactly as planned. But the young pilots of the 50s faced a much more complex situation. The arrival of the jet engine, along with an incredible proliferation of onboard systems, had greatly magnified the difficulties inherent in the job. In addition to new problems of stability and control, the high-speed envelope left a much smaller margin for error. The amount of time in which to make critical decisions was dramatically compressed, and the ever-increasing complexity of the aircraft gave test pilots a lot more to think about. Thus, in addition to exceptional flying skills, applicants to the school now had to have solid engineering backgrounds. And once they entered, they were subjected to an increasingly rigorous academic curriculum before they got the opportunity to learn the intricacies of performance testing, where they had to learn to control airspeed to the nearest knot and hold their altitude at extraordinarily precise levels, to define how far, how fast, and how efficiently an airplane could fly. They went on to learn how to evaluate the subtle nuances of aircraft stability and control, and the often breathtaking intangibles of spin testing, where they had to learn the art of dispassionate data collection while gyrating and plummeting toward an onrushing lake bed. There was no dearth of qualified applicants, because by the early 50s, a whole mystique had grown up about Edwards. It had become a mecca for the very best. Men like Yeager, Tony LeVere, Bob Hoover, Bill Bridgman, Scott Crossfield, Pete Everest, and Fitz Fulton. In an age fascinated by higher, faster, farther, these men won worldwide acclaim. A great many others, who also, day after day, rode on the cutting edge of calamity, didn't. But they came nevertheless, because if it was new, if it was fast, if it was unconventional, it was at Edwards, and it was there that they could pit their skills against the very best among their peers. Then as now, test pilots were intensely competitive. If not always cocky, they were supremely self-confident. They had to be. and they were courageous. They were also disciplined and cautious, always methodically calculating the odds. They were not careless. They couldn't afford to be. There wasn't any margin for error in their business. Knowledge and careful preparation were survival tools. The popular image of the devil-may-care test pilot, raising hell all night and breaking records the next morning, was largely a fiction of tabloid journalism. As Chuck Yeager once so aptly put it,
You can't hoot with the owls all night and fly with the eagles all day. It just don't work that way.
but competitive? Yes. By late 1953, the NACA's Scott Crossfield had already taken the Navy's D-558 Phase II Douglas skyrocket out to Mach 1.96. Pretty good for an airplane which hadn't been designed to fly that fast. But he wanted that next magic number, Mach 2, and he knew that just down the flight line, Yeager was preparing to fly the X-1A, which had been designed to easily exceed that speed. On November 20th, he went up knowing it would be his last chance, and flying an extraordinarily precise profile, he was able to hit Mach 2.005 in a shallow dive. 3 weeks later, Yeager went up intending to obliterate his rival's new record. And indeed he did. But shortly after hitting Mach 2.44, 1,650 miles per hour, he encountered something terrifyingly new as the X-1A tumbled violently out of control. It was called inertial coupling. The X-1A was literally spinning about all three of its axes. Somehow, after tumbling downward wildly for more than 40,000 feet, he recovered to level flight, and with superb flying skill, brought the airplane back to fly another day. And just 8 months later, Major Kit Murray flew it up above 90,000 feet. Their records would stand for less than 3 years. By July of 1956, Lieutenant Colonel Pete Everest had flown the Bell X-2 all the way out to Mach 2.87, where he began to encounter the effects of aerodynamic heating. But he warned of serious stability problems at that speed. Then, in early September, Captain Ivan Kinchlow claimed a new altitude mark as he climbed above 126,000 feet. 3 weeks later, on his first flight in a rocket airplane, Captain Mel App took it up for an assault on Mach 3. He sped to Mach 3.2 that day, more than 2,000 miles per hour, and became the fastest man alive, but only for brief moments. Shortly after hitting top speed, the X-2 spun violently out of control. Bitten, like Yeager, by inertial coupling, App struggled gamely to recover the craft. His efforts were in vain. Mach 3 had been conquered, but at a terrible price. Not all of the research involved rocket planes. The Air Force, along with the NACA, conducted a whole series of programs with exotic research vehicles. The XF-92A demonstrated the feasibility of the Delta Wing and introduced pilots to the touchiness of hydraulically boosted, irreversible flight controls. The needle-nose X-3 Flying Stiletto was ultimately used to explore the problem of high-speed instability. The X-4 Bantam studied the transonic flying qualities of a swept-wing, semi-tailless design. The X-5 demonstrated the performance advantages to be gained by sweeping the wings forward and aft in flight, a concept that would later bear fruit in the design of several frontline combat aircraft. And the unmanned Mach 2 X-10 laid the foundation for remote control of a variety of high-performance air vehicles. Runway vulnerability had long been a major concern. Project Zelmo, for zero-length launch and matte landing, was one of the solutions posed to deal with it. The Zell part proved feasible. Strap a rocket booster on the belly of an F-84, ignite it, and 2.5 seconds later, you're safely airborne. But the MAL part proved just a little more difficult. Zelmo was not the answer. What was needed were true VTOL, or vertical takeoff and landing airplanes. Powered by counter-rotating props, the XF-V1 was supposed to take off or land vertically and transition to conventional flight. Though capable of in-flight transitions, it never achieved either a vertical takeoff or landing. But the jet-powered X-13 Vertijet successfully demonstrated both. And by proving that VTOL flight was possible on jet thrust alone, it opened up a whole new arena of flight. All of the esoteric data from the research programs was applied to the development of new operational designs, and the 50s finally saw the culmination of the turbojet revolution with the development of aircraft which embodied a mature blending of efficient turbojet propulsion and streamlined aerodynamic design. This was nowhere more evident than with the arrival of the famous Century series of truly supersonic fighters. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-101 Voodoo, the 102 Delta Dagger, the Mach 2 F-104 Starfighter, F-105 Thunder Chief, later known more simply as the Thud, F-106 Delta Dart, hailed as the ultimate interceptor, and the F-107 Ultra Sabre, the only Century fighter not to go into operational service. These truly spectacular airplanes defined the basic speed and altitude envelopes for fighters for the rest of the century. And yet each of them also arrived at Edwards with critical flaws, which required years of patient effort to eliminate. But of course, that's always been the purpose of flight testing. High-performance fighters were only part of the story. Test pilots and engineers refined the capabilities of everything, from a new turboprop heavy freighter, the C-133, to the extremely agile and versatile C-130, a classic design which would become the model for tactical transports. And the first jet-powered tanker, KC-135, which would remain in service until well into the next century, as well as a new, truly intercontinental strategic bomber, the YB-52, which would provide the safety net of nuclear deterrence for more than a generation. And, by the end of the decade, the sleek B-58 Hustler, the delta-wing bomber, which would establish some speed and time-to-climb records which still have yet to be broken. As the 60s opened, a group of pilots were undergoing zero-G and other types of training at Edwards. They'd go on to win celebrity status as the Mercury astronauts. They were the first of 3 groups of astronauts whose exploits would remain front-page news as they were catapulted into space in cone-shaped capsules. But there was another group of pilots at Edwards who would make the journey by much different means, in a rocket-powered airplane, the North American X-15. As the decade opened, Scott Crossfield, who had helped design the airplane, was completing its flight worthiness demonstration in preparation for the combined Air Force, NASA, and Navy program, which would probe the unknowns of hypersonic and near-space flight. Then, within the brief span of 8 months in 1961, the X-15's awesome potential was finally unleashed, as it became the first aircraft to exceed Mach 4, 5, and 6. The pilot who made each of those flights, Major Robert M. White, was also the first to fly it in space, as he climbed above 300,000 feet the following year. And, in August of 1963, NASA's Joe Walker took it all the way up to 354,000 feet, 67 miles above the Earth's surface, a record which still stands. 12 men flew the X-15. 8 of them became astronauts by flying an airplane through space. And one of them would go on to become the first man to set foot on the moon. But the program wasn't free of incident. In November of 1962, for example, NASA's Jack McKay lost power shortly after launch and was forced to attempt an emergency landing on Mud Lake in Nevada with nearly full fuel tanks and without landing flaps. At touchdown, the left gear failed. McKay survived the incident, but the airplane looked like a total loss. It was resurrected, however, as the X-15A2, and with a pair of jettisonable external fuel tanks to enable it to reach for higher speeds, and covered with a thermal protection coating, protected from the 2,000-degree heat expected at those speeds. Major Pete Knight took it all the way out to Mach 6.7, 4,520 miles per hour, one day in October of 1967. But at a speed more than twice that of a .50 caliber bullet, the thermal protection failed, permitting torch-like hypersonic air to incinerate parts of the ventral tail. And only by dint of his exceptional piloting skills was he able to bring it safely back. Charred by its wild ride through the inferno of re-entry, it would never fly again. And Pete Knight's record still remains the highest speed at which any man has ever flown in an airplane. As the pace of the space program gained momentum, there were all kinds of related activities at Edwards. At the NASA facility, for instance, they were testing an ungainly-looking machine, which symbolized one of man's greatest aspirations, the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle. And at the Test Pilot School, renamed the Aerospace Research Pilot School, students were now introduced to such arcane subjects as thermodynamics, orbital mechanics, and bioastronautics, and given training in a wide variety of machines designed to simulate various spaceflight conditions. The training they received served them well, and a great many of them, like Jim McDivitt, Frank Borman, and Michael Collins, would go on to make their marks in space. Spaceflight captured the nation's imagination, but the Flight Test Center was still in business to evaluate airplanes. A new supersonic trainer, the T-38 Talon. A rugged new fighter, the F-4 Phantom II, which went on to become a mainstay of the Tactical Air Command. A pair of new transports, the C-141 Starlifter, and its big brother, the gargantuan C-5A Galaxy. And a new Mach 2 fighter bomber, the swing-winged F-111. While those who tested these airplanes didn't get much publicity, their work could be every bit as thrilling as a Mach 5 re-entry in the X-15.
Okay, it's spinning. That's a spin. Okay, it's a spin. Yeah. Okay, now go ahead.
It looks like a feather right
Yeah,
there.
yeah. Opposite order. Full rudder.
He's coming to full.
Okay. Wait a minute. Keep the stick forward.
Like a coming forward. 44.
Going back into the spin, I think. Yeah, I think it is. All right.
42. They floor the spin.
Now it's covered. You got it. You got it. I just quite the story.
Spin shoots.
The spin shoots before I came out. Shoots it off. You got it. Shoots failed. You got it. You got it.
16.
Get out, baby.
14. Eject.
There were a pair of aircraft whose incredibly advanced capabilities still dazzled the imagination. The mammoth 500,000-pound XB-70 Valkyrie was almost routine, flown at Mach 3 speeds and altitudes of 70,000 feet. More impressive still was the mysterious YF-12 Blackbird. Predecessor of the legendary SR-71, this remarkable airplane was able to cruise for extended periods at speeds in excess of Mach 3 and at altitudes somewhere above 80,000 feet. On a single day at Edwards in May of 1965, it set no less than 9 world speed and altitude records without in any way taxing its full potential. While some pilots cruised along at better than 2,000 miles per hour, others explored the concept of laminar flow control, the elimination of drag-inducing boundary layer turbulence over the wings of the X-21A. And still others continued to study VTOL flight. The experimental X-18 tilt-wing aircraft spawned the much more ambitious XC-142. Pilots could transition its entire wing and engine assembly to the vertical for takeoff, and then to the horizontal for conventional flight. Though a feasible concept, The future still seemed to lie with jet thrust, and the XV-5 employed that thrust to drive counter-rotating fans within its wings to create vertical lift. More radical still, the XV-6A Kestrel relied upon vector thrust, provided by its powerful turbofan engine and channeled through rotating nozzles. The technology so ably demonstrated by this experimental airplane would be applied directly to the design of the successful Harrier and AV-8 combat aircraft of today. It was called the Flying Bathtub. Fabricated from steel tubing and plywood, the M2F1 was the first in a series of curious-looking, wingless craft that descended to landings on Rogers Dry Lake from the mid-60s through the early 70s. They were called lifting bodies, and subsequent designs, such as the M2F2, HL-10, X-24A, and X-24B, were all metal and rocket-powered. They were used to determine whether or not, through the use of energy management techniques, these low-lift-to-drag shapes could make precision landings after high-speed, unpowered, gliding descents from high altitudes. The descents in these craft, NASA's Milt Thompson noted, were so rapid that the lake bed rushes up towards you like a straight arm from a fullback. Nevertheless, they demonstrated that they could indeed make precision landings, even on concrete runways, with remarkable touchdown accuracies. And in doing so, they made a signal contribution to the American space effort because they validated the approach and landing techniques that would later be employed by the first true spaceships, the Space Shuttle. Edwards witnessed the beginning of a new revolution during the 70s. Whereas in the past, the emphasis had been on making airplanes fly faster and higher, now it was on making them fly more efficiently. A wide array of new aerodynamic concepts and sophisticated systems based on high-speed computers made this possible. In the early 70s, NASA modified an F-8 Crusader to explore a new aerodynamic concept, the supercritical wing. Flattened on top and tapering downward at the trailing edge, the thin wing promised enormous performance advantages, permitting jetliners to increase their speeds while burning less fuel. The success of this program gave rise to the NASA Air Force F-111 Transonic Aircraft program, in which the concept was explored for possible military applications. The advent of compact, high-speed digital computers enabled NASA to explore the potential of fly-by-wire flight controls on another modified F-8. In addition to their speed and light weight, constantly active controls combined with electronic sensors could provide artificial stability and thus relieve designers of the burden of having to build inherently stable aircraft and focus instead on peak performance and agility. The Air Force went on to pursue the logic of the electronics revolution with the Digitac A-7 aircraft, which provided the pilot with selectable control modes, each of them tailored to optimize the craft's tracking and handling qualities for a specific weapons delivery task, such as bombing, or air-to-air, or air-to-ground gunnery. The advantages conferred by these and other new technologies were quickly applied to new operational designs. The YF-16 Fighting Falcon, for example, was the first to employ digital fly-by-wire, which permitted it to be inherently unstable and thus far more responsive and agile than any other fighter of its generation. It also permitted the F-16 to be used as a testbed to investigate newer control-configured concepts which could be applied to future generation fighter designs. While the YF-16 had bested the twin-engine YF-17 in the Air Force's competition for a lightweight fighter, the YF-17, impressive in its own right, would ultimately be developed into the Navy's very successful FA-18 Hornet. Dramatic breakthroughs in metallurgy and propulsion technology permitted the new F-15 Eagle to be configured with engines whose thrust, for the first time, exceeded the aircraft's weight. The first Air Force fighter designed specifically for the air superiority role since the legendary F-86, its unparalleled performance, combined with its vast array of sophisticated radar and fire control systems, provided it with an unparalleled combat capability. It had also been years since the Air Force had dedicated an aircraft solely to close air support. That gap was filled in the early 70s when the YA-9 flew head-to-head against the YA-10, in a competition ultimately won by the A-10. Literally built around a 30mm cannon, the Thunderbolt II was developed into a combat system capable of delivering awesomely destructive firepower. While test pilots at Edwards evaluated the capabilities of a new advanced tanker cargo aircraft, the wide-body KC-10 Extender, flight researchers were also investigating the future of air transport with the YC-14 and 15. A pair of short takeoff and landing technology demonstrators embodying the latest concepts in aerodynamics, propulsion, and flight controls, which would be applied directly to the next generation of cargo aircraft. For the first time in more than 2 decades, the combat potential of a new intercontinental strategic bomber was also evaluated. The B-1A was designed to contend with the revolution in air defense technologies which had taken place since the late 50s. Instead of speed and altitude, elusiveness was now the key to the penetration of enemy airspace. And the terrain-hugging B-1 was designed to evade enemy radar by flying fast and low. Many said, however, that the day of the manned bomber was past, and in the late 70s, it was canceled. But to paraphrase Mark Twain, all reports of the demise of the manned bomber and the B-1 were quite premature. For the interim, an old warhorse, the venerable B-52, was updated with new avionics, tested as a standoff launch platform for sophisticated air-launched cruise missiles capable of navigating on their own over hundreds of miles of terrain, hitting a target on the center's Utah Test and Training Range with pinpoint accuracy. It would never fly in space or even exceed the speed of sound, but the shuttle Enterprise set the stage for sister ships that would. Launched from atop a 747 jumbo jet, it would make a critical series of unpowered approach and landing tests at Edwards during 1977 that paved the way for man's first gliding descents from outer space. And indeed, just 4 years later, in April of 1981, Edwards once again became the scene of high drama as the Space Shuttle Columbia's wheels touched down on Rogers Dry Lake after it had passed through a fiery re-entry at more than 17,000 miles per hour halfway around the globe. The shuttles marked the dawn of a new era in space exploration, the era of reusable space vehicles, true spaceships, and it seemed only fitting that Edwards, where so much aerospace history had been made, where so much of the work that had made the shuttle possible had been accomplished, that Edwards should be the site of its milestone flights. While shuttle operations proceeded, flight researchers at Edwards continued to advance knowledge in the aeronautical realm throughout the 1980s, as they studied the characteristics of unique aircraft, such as NASA's scissor-winged AD-1, which was tested to explore the possible performance advantages to be gained by pivoting an airplane's entire wing while in flight. Benefiting from remarkable advances in composite materials, the X-29 soared on blade-thin wings that actually swept forward so that Air Force and NASA researchers could explore the configuration's potential for enhanced agility, better low-speed handling qualities, and lower stall speeds. The Advanced Fighter Technology Integration, or AFTI F-111, explored the performance advantages promised by a mission-adaptive wing. A flexible, absolutely smooth-surfaced, variable cambered wing, which could be configured to optimize maneuverability, performance, and fuel efficiency for each phase of the airplane's envelope. And the AFTI F-16, which incorporated features permitting it to fly as no other aircraft had ever flown. A triplex digital flight control system and forward-mounted canards, for example, that permitted it to turn without banking. A voice-actuated command system, an automated maneuvering attack system, and a host of other new technologies applicable to the whole spectrum of tactical combat operations. The Air Force's short takeoff and landing and maneuvering technology demonstrator F-15 was yet another one-of-a-kind testbed. Configured with two-dimensional thrust vectoring and reversing engine nozzles, it demonstrated much enhanced agility and dramatically improved STOL capabilities. Over the years, veteran test pilot Fitz Fulton had skillfully guided many a stricken ship to safe landings at Edwards. But in December of 1984, he was sitting in a cockpit on the ground as he intentionally guided a perfectly healthy 720 jetliner to a crash landing. The test was conducted to evaluate a fuel additive, which promised to prevent the ignition of massive fireballs. It obviously didn't work, and predictably, reporters called the test failure. They were wrong. Not only did it demonstrate the ineffectiveness of the additive, it also provided a wealth of information that would enhance flight safety in the future. One of the most spectacular events of the 80s, however, occurred not on the lake bed, but high over the Pacific, where Major Doug Pearson prepared to find the proverbial needle in a haystack as he launched a missile toward a satellite orbiting high overhead.
Eagle 06 is under recovery. Hey, here, you beautiful son of a bitch! God, is that beautiful? F-15's out over the sky, a missile going up. Nailed that Hummer. I had to do one little roll anyway.
The anti-satellite missile scored a direct hit in a technological feat which might never again be duplicated. One-of-a-kind aircraft and events have become almost commonplace at Edwards over the years, but they represent only a small part of the center's workload. The primary job has always been to ensure that, if the need arises, American air crews will go into combat with the most effective and reliable operational aircraft in the world. And it continued to meet this challenge as the capabilities of existing systems were refined and expanded, and as dynamic new capabilities, such as the Lantern system, were added. The painstaking development of this system at Edwards paid off dramatically, as Lantern proved it could deny adversaries the once comforting sanctuary of night. Because they're expected to have extended service lives, modern combat planes are designed with an enormous amount of growth potential, which will enable them to meet new requirements and keep up with the rapid pace of technological change. The modified F-16XL, for example, was proposed to meet a new requirement for a fighter combining air-to-air and interdiction capabilities. Its potential was compared with that of the twin-engine F-15 in an evaluation which ultimately resulted in the development of the new F-15E dual-role fighter, a craft which would go on to prove its remarkable combat effectiveness in the Persian Gulf. All airplanes, and especially highly sophisticated combat airplanes, suffer growing pains as they pass through the lengthy ordeal of development. The B-1B, revived in the early 80s, certainly had more than its share of critics throughout the decade, but it truly represented an amalgam of incredibly complex, state-of-the-art systems, and despite its critics, it was developed into the most potent penetrating bomber in the world. More impressive still, promising the ability to penetrate any airspace without the need for complex defensive avionics. The B-2 Advanced Technology Bomber was the first giant flying wing to soar over the base 4 decades. Its thin silhouette, compound curves, its stealth technology promised the ultimate cloak of invisibility, even against the most sophisticated air defense radar systems. Like the turbojet engine 4 decades earlier, stealth technology promised to revolutionize the design and capabilities of combat aircraft. And as the Flight Test Center entered the 90s and began to face the tremendous technological challenges of the 21st century, it was engaged in the evaluation of a pair of competing designs which embodied the latest in that technology. The radically different appearance of the YF-22 and the YF-23 was really but a pale reflection of the quantum leap in capabilities which each represented. Built for stealth, they were also beneficiaries of the many technologies, innovative concepts, which had recently proven their worth in tests at Edwards. Indeed, they took them a step or more further and blended them into fighter prototypes whose stretched the imagination. To fighter jocks from any previous era, for example, the possibility that they could cruise at supersonic speeds without use of an afterburner was little more than a fantasy dream. In these aircraft, the dream became reality. incredibly worthy opponents. Only one could win. And in April 1991, the YF-22 was selected to project American air power into the 21st century as the Advanced Tactical Fighter. Flight testing such craft has become a remarkably complex operation. Where once, not so long ago, knee pads and pilot recall provided practically the only instrumentation, systems-intensive fighters are now instrumented for as many as 4,000 different parameters, and the data is telemetered instantly to the ground for analysis even before the pilot touches down. We're in an age of spiraling technology, especially in the burgeoning field of electronic systems, and this has created an information explosion which makes each flight test hour incredibly valuable and costly. To reduce those costs, the Flight Test Center has built up an impressive ground test capability in recent years, the largest anechoic chamber in the nation, a neighboring facility for integrated avionics testing, and a test and evaluation mission simulator. They comprise the core of a capability to thoroughly test a full range of onboard electronic systems on the ground before they're subjected to the real world of flight test, where indeed they'll always still have to ultimately prove their worth. Edwards has been called a place where dreams take flight. And truly, for more than 40 years, the Air Force, indeed the whole world of aerospace, has continued to meet its future in the skies above its sprawling expanse. The history of the base is a kaleidoscope of images representing man's greatest achievements in flight. There's a special feeling that one gets there, an awareness of continuity. The lake bed remains a welcome haven for pilots in distress. An uncommon sense of achievement and tradition, unforgettable links to the legendary past, and an overpowering feeling of expectation, of a limitless future, and almost an article of faith, the belief that if it can happen, it will probably happen here. The story of Edwards, then, is a fabric woven of change and continuity, and so well symbolized in the Flight Test Center's logo. For the legend at its base, ad inexplorata, Latin for toward the unexplored, is really more than just a motto. It represents a bridge between its past, its present, and its future.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.